Imagine being so hated that nearly 2,000 years later, your name still makes people shudder. Meet Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the Roman emperor whose reign became a masterclass in how absolute power corrupts absolutely. This isn't just another tale of ancient excess. This is the story of a man who allegedly watched Rome burn while playing his lyre, who murdered his own mother in cold blood, and who kicked his pregnant wife to death in a fit of rage. But here's what's truly chilling about Nero's story. Much of what we think we know might be propaganda, yet the documented truth is somehow even more disturbing. When Nero ascended to the throne in 54 AD at just 16 years old, he inherited the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Within 14 years, he would transform that inheritance into a legacy of terror that would echo through history. The Romans, who had survived civil wars, plagues, and barbarian invasions, would look back on Nero's reign as one of the darkest chapters in their thousand-year story. They called him a monster, a madman, the Antichrist himself. But was he really the deranged tyrant history painted him to be, or was he something far more complex and perhaps more terrifying? Consider this. Nero didn't start as a monster. Early accounts describe a young emperor who showed promise, who was guided by respected advisors, who even demonstrated mercy and cultural sophistication. He was an artist, a performer, someone who genuinely believed he was improving Roman society. So what transforms a promising young ruler into someone who would order his own mother's assassination, who would execute his wife for the crime of being unable to bear him children, and who would kick his second wife so brutally that she died from her injuries while pregnant with his child? The answer lies not just in Nero's personal psychology, but in the toxic dynamics of Imperial Roman power itself. This was a world where family members routinely murdered each other for political advantage, where a single paranoid decision could unleash a cascade of violence that consumed everyone in its path. Nero's story is ultimately about how a system designed to concentrate unlimited power in one person's hands inevitably corrupts that person and destroys everyone around them. But perhaps most unsettling of all is how Nero's descent into paranoia and violence followed a recognizable pattern. It started with small betrayals, minor cruelties, justified as political necessities. Then came the point of no return. The moment when preservation of power became more important than any moral boundary. Once Nero crossed that line, each subsequent atrocity became easier to rationalize, each murder more necessary than the last. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD would become the defining moment of Nero's reign, though probably not in the way he intended. Whether he actually started the fire or simply failed to respond appropriately, the blaze consumed not just buildings, but any remaining public trust in their emperor. In the fire's aftermath, Nero's persecution of Christians would introduce the world to a new kind of systematic religious violence, while his increasingly erratic behavior would set the stage for brutal family murders that shocked even a society accustomed to imperial violence. By the time Nero's reign ended in 68 AD, he had fundamentally changed what it meant to be a Roman emperor, and not for the better. His legacy would serve as both warning and template for future tyrants, a reminder that unlimited power in the wrong hands doesn't just corrupt the ruler, it can destroy an entire civilization from within. Picture this. You're 16 years old lounging around your villa when suddenly someone walks in and tells you congratulations, you're now the most powerful person on earth. That was Nero's Tuesday in October 54 AD, when Emperor Claudius mysteriously died after eating a plate of mushrooms, and overnight, a teenage boy became master of the Roman Empire. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Nero didn't stumble into power by accident. He was placed there by the most ruthless political operative Rome had ever seen his own mother. Agrippina the Younger wasn't just ambitious. She was a woman who had clawed her way through 3 marriages, burying husbands and accumulating power like a master chess player. Positioning pieces for checkmate, her first 2 husbands died conveniently early, leaving her wealthy and connected. But it was her third marriage to Emperor Claudius that revealed the true scope of her genius. Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, the rightful heir, but Agrippina had something more valuable than bloodline. She had cunning. Within months of marrying Claudius, she convinced him to adopt Nero, making her teenage son suddenly ahead of Britannicus in the line of succession. Contemporary historians whispered that she used every tool at her disposal, from sexual manipulation to carefully planted political allies, to reshape the imperial succession. Tacitus wrote that she moved through the palace like a spider weaving webs that even the emperor couldn't see. But Agrippina's masterpiece wasn't just getting Nero adopted. It was eliminating the competition when Claudius began showing signs of regret about sidelining his biological son. Those famous mushrooms appeared on his dinner table. Historians still debate whether she actually poisoned him, but the timing was suspiciously perfect, just as Claudius seemed ready to restore Britannicus. He was dead, and 16-year-old Nero stood ready to inherit the throne. The early years of Nero's reign looked like a golden age. Rome prospered, trade flourished, and the empire seemed more stable than it had been in decades. Nero threw spectacular games, funded massive public works, projects, and appeared to genuinely care about the common people. He reduced taxes, expanded citizenship rights, and even attempted legal reforms that protected slaves from excessive cruelty. For a moment, it seemed like Rome had found its ideal emperor. Behind this prosperity stood Agrippina. Pulling strings like a master puppeteer, she had spent years cultivating relationships with senators, military commanders, and wealthy merchants, creating a network of allies who owed their positions to her influence. Contemporary accounts describe how she would sit behind a curtain during official meetings, literally whispering instructions to her teenage son. The Emperor Nero initially thrived under this arrangement. He loved the pageantry of power, the adoration of crowds, and the unlimited resources to pursue his artistic interests. He fancied himself a poet, a musician, and an actor, much to the horror of the Roman elite, who considered such pursuits beneath imperial dignity. But with Agrippina managing the boring details of governance, Nero could indulge his creative fantasies while basking in the glory of being the most powerful person alive. Yet even during these prosperous early years, there were warning signs. Nero's temper could flare unpredictably. He showed disturbing fascination with violence and death. And most ominously, he began to resent his mother's control. What had started as a perfect partnership between ambitious mother and eager son was developing cracks that would eventually tear the empire apart. The seeds of madness were already planted in Rome's golden boy, and soon the world would discover that unlimited power in the hands of someone who had never learned limits was a recipe for unimaginable horror. But first, there would be fire, lots of fire. July 19th, 64 AD. Rome burns. For 6 days and 7 nights, flames devour the greatest city in the world, while its emperor allegedly stands on his palace balcony, lyre in hand, singing the Sack of Troy as real screams echo through smoke-filled streets. At least, that's what history remembers. But what actually happened that summer night when Rome became hell on earth? The fire started in the Circus Maximus, among the shops selling flammable goods. Whether it began by accident or design, nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that once those flames caught hold, they moved like a living thing through Rome's narrow streets and wooden tenements. The poor districts, crammed with desperate families, became death traps. People threw themselves into the Tiber River rather than burn alive. Others were trampled in the chaos as entire neighborhoods disappeared into smoke and ash. Here's where the story gets complicated. While Rome burned, Nero wasn't even in the city. He was 35 miles away in Antium, his seaside retreat. When word reached him that his capital was dying, he rushed back immediately. Far from the monster playing music while people suffered, contemporary accounts describe an emperor who opened his own palace gardens to refugees, arranged emergency food supplies, and personally supervised rescue efforts. But rumors are harder to kill than flames. Within days, whispers began spreading through the refugee camps. Nero had started the fire himself. Why? because he wanted to clear space for his grand architectural projects, because he was mad, because he hated his own people. The story of him playing the lyre while Rome burned became gospel truth, even though the lyre was the wrong instrument entirely. If he'd been performing, it would have been on a kithara. The accusations weren't entirely without foundation. Nero had indeed been planning massive urban renewal projects, and the fire conveniently cleared prime real estate. When he began construction on his Golden House, a palace complex so vast it covered roughly 300 acres of the burned district, it seemed to confirm everyone's worst suspicions. Here was an emperor building paradise on his people's graves. But Nero wasn't stupid. He knew how the fire looked. He knew the whispers were spreading. So he did what any political leader facing a crisis would do. He found someone else to blame. Enter the Christians, a small, peculiar sect that most Romans viewed with suspicion anyway. According to the historian Tacitus, writing decades later, Nero accused the Christians of arson and launched a persecution so brutal it shocked even Rome's bloodthirsty crowds. Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified. Some were coated in pitch and set on fire to serve as human torches for Nero's garden parties. The cruelty was so extreme that it backfired. Instead of convincing Romans of Christian guilt, it made them pity the victims and hate their emperor even more. The truth about the Great Fire died with everyone who witnessed it. What survived was something more powerful than facts. A story that perfectly captured who Nero had become in his people's minds. A ruler so disconnected from reality, so drunk on power that he could make art while his subjects died. Whether he actually started the fire or simply failed to mourn it properly, the damage to his reputation was permanent. Rome would rebuild, bigger and better than before, but Nero's image never recovered from those 6 days when the world burned, and its emperor seemed to care more about his palace than his people's lives. Your mother orchestrated your rise to power, eliminated your rivals, and placed the crown on your head, but now she's becoming inconvenient, questioning your decisions, threatening your authority. What do you do? If you're Nero, you murder her. Not in a moment of rage, but through calculated, cold-blooded planning that would make even the most hardened criminals pause. By 59 AD, the relationship between Nero and his mother Agrippina had transformed from political partnership into a deadly power struggle. Agrippina, who had maneuvered brilliantly to place her son on the throne, now found herself increasingly marginalized as Nero asserted his independence. She had expected to rule through him, to remain the power behind the throne, but Nero had other plans. The breaking point came when Agrippina openly criticized Nero's affair with Poppaea Sabina and threatened to support Britannicus's claim to the throne. For a paranoid emperor who saw enemies everywhere, his mother's opposition wasn't just political inconvenience. It was existential threat. But killing the most powerful woman in Rome required more than simple assassination. It needed to look like an accident. Nero's first attempt reads like something from a twisted inventor's nightmare. He commissioned a collapsible boat designed to fall apart and drown his mother during what appeared to be a pleasure cruise. The mechanical boat actually worked, timbers separating as planned, but Agrippina proved tougher than her son anticipated. She swam to shore, injured but very much alive, and very much aware that her son had just tried to murder her. Most people would flee. Agrippina sent Nero a message saying she was fine and thanked the gods for preserving her from the accident. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also sealed her fate. There would be no more elaborate schemes, no more attempts at plausible deniability. Nero dispatched his Praetorian prefects to Agrippina's villa that same night. When they arrived, she knew exactly why they had come. According to historical accounts, she faced her killers with the same steely determination that had characterized her entire life. She reportedly pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here," referring to the body that had carried the emperor. The soldiers obliged, stabbing her repeatedly until she was dead. The murder of Agrippina sent shockwaves through Roman society. Matricide was considered one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, a violation of the natural order that even Romans, accustomed to political violence, found deeply disturbing. Nero tried to justify the killing by claiming his mother had plotted against him, but few believed it. The evidence was too thin, the timing too convenient, the methods too elaborate. What made the crime even more chilling was how it revealed Nero's evolving psychology. This wasn't a crime of passion or political necessity. It was the calculated elimination of someone who had become inconvenient. The emperor who had once needed his mother's guidance now saw her knowledge of his weaknesses as a liability. Every person who had helped him rise to power was now a potential threat who knew too much about his vulnerabilities. The successful murder of Agrippina marked a turning point in Nero's reign. If he could kill the woman who had made him emperor, if he could eliminate his own mother and survive the political fallout, then no one was safe. The precedent was set, the psychological barrier crossed. From this moment forward, Nero would view murder not as a last resort, but as a convenient solution to personal and political problems. Family loyalty, the cornerstone of Roman society, had become another casualty of Nero's paranoia. His wife would be next. You marry your first wife for politics, divorce her for love, then murder them both within 3 years. This was Nero's twisted version of Roman family values. After disposing of his mother Agrippina, the emperor's bloodlust turned toward the women who shared his bed, transforming imperial marriage into a death sentence. Octavia never stood a chance. Claudius's daughter, married to Nero when she was just 13, represented everything politically useful and personally inconvenient about arranged imperial marriages. For years, she endured her husband's public humiliations, his affairs, his theatrical performances, his obvious preference for anyone but her. But staying quietly in the background wouldn't save her life. When Nero fell obsessively in love with Poppaea Sabina, a married woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition, Octavia became an obstacle to be removed. Poppaea whispered poison in Nero's ear, convincing him that his wife posed a threat to their future together. In 59 AD, Nero divorced Octavia on fabricated charges of adultery, a charge that would have been laughable if it weren't so deadly, given Octavia's reputation for virtue. The Roman people loved Octavia. When news of the divorce spread, crowds gathered in the streets, pulling down Poppaea's statues and demanding their beloved empress be restored. For a brief moment, it seemed public pressure might save her. Nero even allowed Octavia to return to the palace. But Poppaea, now pregnant with Nero's child, understood that her rival's very existence would always threaten her position. What happened next reveals the calculated cruelty that defined Nero's reign. Unable to convince the public that Octavia deserved death, Nero manufactured evidence. He tortured Octavia's slaves until one finally provided false testimony about an affair with Anicetus, the freedman who had helped murder Agrippina. The irony was deliberate. The man who had killed Nero's mother would now provide the lies needed to destroy his wife. Octavia was exiled to the island of Pandateria, the same desolate rock where Augustus had banished his daughter Julia decades earlier. There, in 62 AD, Roman soldiers arrived with their final orders. They opened her veins and placed her in a scalding bath to speed the bleeding. She was 21 years old, guilty of nothing but being inconvenient to a monster. Nero married Poppaea 12 days later, but even love couldn't save you from Nero's violence. For 3 years, Poppaea enjoyed the emperor's devotion, bearing him a daughter who died in infancy and becoming pregnant again by 65 AD. Yet their relationship was turbulent, marked by Nero's increasingly erratic behavior and explosive temper. The end came suddenly. Historical sources differ on the exact circumstances, but they agree on the brutality. Suetonius claims Nero kicked his pregnant wife to death during a violent argument, while Tacitus suggests she died from the effects of a beating. Either way, the message was clear. Proximity to Nero meant death, whether you were his enemy or his beloved. Poppaea's death marked a turning point. Where Octavia's murder had been calculated and political, Poppeia's was impulsive and personal. Nero had killed his mother for power, his wife for convenience, and his lover in rage. Each death revealed another layer of his descent into madness, showing how paranoia and cruelty had consumed whatever humanity remained in the man who ruled the world. The emperor, who had once claimed to love Poppaea so deeply he'd murder for her, had ultimately destroyed her, just as thoroughly as he'd destroyed everyone else who came too close to his poisonous orbit. By 66 AD, the man who once boasted that no prince had ever known what power truly meant was discovering its limits in the most brutal way possible. Nero's empire wasn't just cracking, it was hemorrhaging from wounds he'd inflicted himself, and the emperor who'd murdered his way to absolute control was about to learn that even absolute power has an expiration date. The first cracks appeared in Gaul, where Julius Vindex raised the standard of revolt. But this wasn't just another provincial uprising that could be crushed with a few legions. Vindex had something Nero's previous enemies lacked: moral authority. When a Roman governor publicly declares that the emperor has become a disgrace to the empire itself, people listen. Vindex's message spread like wildfire through the provinces. Rome deserved better than a matricidal madman who spent the treasury on golden palaces while citizens starved. Then came the blow that shattered Nero's world completely. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the iron-willed governor of Hispania, Tarraconensis, declared himself emperor, not governor in rebellion, not provincial upstart, emperor. For the first time in 14 years, someone was directly challenging Nero's right to the purple, and this wasn't some ambitious senator whispering in shadows. This was open war. Panic consumed Nero like nothing had before. The man who'd casually ordered his mother's assassination now trembled at every shadow. He drafted wild schemes. Perhaps he could flee to Egypt and live as a private citizen, or maybe throw himself on the mercy of the Parthians. These weren't the calculated moves of a tyrant. They were the deathy throes of a cornered animal who suddenly realized his claws couldn't save him. But the killing stroke came from where it always does in Rome: the Praetorian Guard, when Nymphidius Sabinus, prefect of the very men sworn to protect Nero's life, declared for Galba, the emperor's fate was sealed. The Praetorians had tasted Galba's gold and decided Nero's paranoid coin wasn't worth their loyalty anymore. In Rome, loyalty flowed toward power, and power was hemorrhaging from Nero faster than blood from his victims. The Senate's declaration hit like a thunderbolt. Nero was now an enemy of the Roman people, to be executed in the ancient manner. Stripped naked, his neck locked in a wooden fork, beaten to death with rods. The same Senate that had once trembled before him now condemned him to a death more humiliating than he'd given his worst enemies. On June 9th, 68 AD, hiding in his freedman Phaon's villa like a common criminal, Nero faced the unthinkable. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he could hear hoofbeats. The Praetorians were coming. His hands shaking, he pressed a dagger to his throat. Even now, at the very end, his actor's ego couldn't help itself. "What an artist dies in me," he whispered, as if his greatest tragedy was depriving the world of his theatrical genius rather than ending a reign of unprecedented cruelty. The blade went in just as the horsemen arrived. Rome's most theatrical emperor had staged his final performance, a one-man show with an audience of grave-diggers and the ghosts of everyone he'd murdered to keep this moment at bay. The boy who'd ascended the throne with such promise, who'd been guided by the wisest men in Rome, died alone and despised, his last words a testament to the vanity that had corrupted everything he touched. The empire that had trembled before Nero's madness barely paused to mourn him. Rome had survived its monster, but the scars he'd carved into the imperial soul would fester for generations. When Nero took his own life in 68 AD, driving a dagger into his throat while muttering, "What an artist perishes in me," he left behind more than just a corpse. He left behind a name that would become synonymous with everything Rome feared most about absolute power: But here's what's truly chilling about Nero's legacy. It wasn't just his cruelty that terrified people. It was how easily a civilized society could descend into madness under one man's unchecked ambition. The Romans had a word for it: savitia, savage cruelty. And Nero didn't just practice it, he perfected it into an art form. Within decades of his death, parents across the empire were using his name to frighten children into obedience. Behave, or Nero will come for you. But the real horror wasn't in the bedtime stories. It was in how quickly the Romans themselves had enabled his transformation from teenage emperor to genocidal monster. Think about it. This was a man who murdered his own mother, then stood over her corpse, examining the body that had given him life. He kicked his pregnant wife to death, then married a boy who resembled his first wife, after having him castrated. He turned Christians into human torches to light his garden parties. Yet for years, the Roman elite applauded, laughed at his jokes, and competed for his favor. They weren't just witnesses to his madness, they were accomplices to it. The historians who came after Nero painted him as a monster, but they missed the deeper truth. Tacitus called him the enemy of the human race. Suetonius documented his every perversion with disgusted fascination. Dio Cassius wrote that he was the most shameless of men. But what terrified them wasn't just Nero's individual cruelty, it was the realization that their entire system had produced him. Their beloved Roman values, their military might, their sophisticated culture, all of it had culminated in a man who fed senators to wild beasts for entertainment. The Christians, ironically, gave Nero his most enduring legacy. To them, he became nothing less than the Antichrist. Early Christian writers believed he would rise from the dead to herald the end times. The book of Revelation, with its beast marked by the number 6, was widely interpreted as a coded reference to Nero. His persecution of Christians was so brutal that it transformed him into the ultimate symbol of evil in the Western imagination. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Nero's legacy is how it echoes through history. Every dictator who has followed, from Caligula to Stalin to modern tyrants, has walked a path that Nero first carved. The pattern is always the same: charismatic leader, gradual accumulation of power, elimination of rivals, descent into paranoid brutality. Nero didn't invent tyranny, but he perfected its psychological architecture. What makes Nero's story truly haunting is how ordinary people enabled every step of his descent. The senators who voted him divine honors after he murdered his mother. The crowds who cheered his performances while Rome burned. The soldiers who carried out his increasingly insane orders. They weren't evil, they were afraid, ambitious, or simply trying to survive. But their complicity made his reign possible. Today, when we use the word Nero to describe someone, we're not just talking about cruelty. We're talking about the complete corruption of power, the transformation of a human being into something monstrous. We're talking about what happens when a society loses its moral courage to say no to the unthinkable. That's Nero's true legacy, not just the reminder that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but the terrifying proof that civilized people will applaud while it happens. By the summer of 68 AD, the most powerful man in the world was hiding in a suburban villa outside Rome, clutching a dagger to his own throat while his few remaining servants dug his grave. This was Nero's final act, not the dramatic suicide of a tragic hero, but the desperate, bungled death of a man who had systematically destroyed everything and everyone around him. When we strip away the centuries of myth and sensationalism, what emerges is something far more disturbing than the caricature of a mad emperor fiddling while Rome burned. Nero's story reveals how absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it devours. Here was a young man who ascended to the throne with genuine artistic aspirations and popular support. Yet, within 14 years, had murdered his mother, his wives, countless senators, and possibly thousands of Christians. The question isn't whether Nero was born evil. It's how the intoxication of unlimited authority transformed him into the monster history remembers. The most chilling aspect of Nero's reign wasn't his alleged pyromania during the Great Fire. Modern historians largely dismiss that tale as propaganda. It was his methodical elimination of anyone who might threaten his position, starting with his own family. When he ordered his mother Agrippina's assassination, he crossed a line that even ancient Romans found shocking. Matricide violated the most fundamental bonds of Roman society. Yet this wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated, planned, and executed with cold precision. Nero's treatment of his wives reveals the same pattern. Octavia's execution wasn't driven by rage, but by political necessity when he wanted to marry Poppaea. Even Poppeia's death, whether from his violent kick or complications from pregnancy, stemmed from his inability to accept any challenge to his will. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were symptoms of a mind that had lost any capacity for recognizing limits. Perhaps most tragically, Nero genuinely believed he was beloved by the people. He performed on stage, convinced of his artistic genius, while his empire crumbled around him. This delusion persisted until his final days, when he reportedly lamented that the world was losing a great artist. The gap between his self-perception and reality had become so vast that even facing death, he couldn't comprehend the magnitude of his failures. The senators who finally turned against him weren't motivated by noble ideals. They were terrified. After watching Nero eliminate anyone who posed even an imagined threat, they realized that survival meant removing him from power. His suicide wasn't the grand finale of a tragic opera. It was the inevitable end of a reign built on fear and violence. Nero's legacy isn't found in the buildings he constructed or the provinces he conquered. It lives in the warning his story provides about the corruption of absolute authority. Every dictator who has followed, from Caligula to Stalin to modern tyrants, has walked a path Nero helped pave. They share his paranoia, his inability to distinguish between loyalty and terror, and his ultimate isolation from reality. When that dagger finally found its mark in a dusty villa outside Rome, it didn't just end one man's life. It closed a chapter on what happens when power faces no meaningful constraints. Nero's death marked not the fall of a great emperor, but the inevitable collapse of a system that had allowed one person's madness to terrorize millions. The lesson remains as relevant today as it was nearly 2,000 years ago. Absolute power doesn't create gods, it creates monsters.